How many of you guys have noticed that surveys are increasingly starting to include a whole bunch of response options when you're asked to provide your gender? I see it all the time. Those are likely consumer-based surveys rather than research studies, but it's starting to happen there as well. And now we're getting published articles that describe the importance of doing so, and even how to do it. An article that I recently came across argues that researchers should stop treating gender as binary. The article is titled, I'm going to put it up right here for you. It's titled Gender Mismeasurement, Guidelines for Respecting Gender Diversity in Psychological Research. Now, at first, that sounds simple enough. If somebody's in your study, then count them accurately and include them when you describe your sample. But I want to walk through their 5 recommendations right here, one by one. I want to talk about what's logical and where the paper stops being a guide for good measurement and starts avoiding the statistical problem that it creates. If you're new here, my name is Todd, and I make videos that affect men by breaking down research, data, policy topics, and psychology, all of it to hopefully help men learn something new. I'd love it if you subscribe so we can keep reaching more and more guys. So let's dive into the author's suggestions about properly measuring gender in research studies, and if they're even reasonable. Now, the author's first recommendation is that researchers should stop using a strictly binary male, female, or man-woman question and instead use an inclusive measure, right? No surprise here, none at all. Their preferred version is to use an open-ended question like this here, in which they're asked, I identify my gender as, and then you allow them space to either write or type in whatever response they want. I'm going to tell you right now, that's an absolute nightmare. Now, their rationale is that a binary-only question may force some people to choose an answer that they regard as inaccurate. They might skip the item altogether, or they might be recorded in a category that they don't identify with. They treat that as both an ethical problem and a measurement problem. So their argument is, if you ask a demographic question, the question should allow respondents to answer it accurately. But that assumes that people believe that more than 2 genders is accurate. And it also opens up the door to 100 genders like we've been seeing and hearing about. Again, could you imagine doing a survey or a research study and everybody writing in their gender? For those of you who are familiar with cleaning data in particular and figuring out what to do with it, that is an absolute nightmare. Now, their second recommendation is to report the frequency of all gender identities that are represented in the sample. Again, first we got to get past that first hurdle that we just spoke about. They say that this serves several purposes. For example, it shows who actually participated. Nothing wrong with that. It avoids making transgender or non-binary participants invisible in reporting. And by the way, I should have said this maybe a little bit upfront. Sorry that it skipped my mind. Pew Research reported, I think it was in 2022, that 1.6% of the American population reports or identifies as something other than male or female. It's something like 5% for Gen Z, I think, and younger, 30 and younger, something like mid-teens to 30, some about 5% there. And then you get past age 30, and there's very, very few. But nationally, 1.6%. So could you imagine making all of these changes, everything that we do for that 1.6%? We're going through all of these methodological changes and recommendations. I'll leave that there. Let me know what you think about it, but that's all I'm going to say about that. They also say, back to the topic, that this helps readers to judge the sample's representativeness and its generalizability. I get it. Nothing wrong with saying, hey, you know what? We got these non-binary people over here, and that's who they are. Now, they particularly object to reporting residual categories as other because they see that wording as implying that men and women are the only normal categories and everyone else is abnormal. Which, to this just came into my mind. One of the things I learned in abnormal psychology as an undergraduate student is that just because something is abnormal doesn't mean that it's deficient or dysfunctional. The fact that, let's say, everybody in my neighborhood, in my community, is driving a Chevrolet and I drive a Ford, that's abnormal. It doesn't mean that I'm doing anything wrong. It just means I'm not doing what everybody else is doing. So use of abnormal there, I don't think is is very accurate or helpful. Anyway, back to the topic of them saying to not use other as a category to designate gender. One of the things that they report is that having more specific and accurate identities can scientifically be useful because future research might be able to aggregate data from many studies, right? Whether it's a meta-analysis or something like that, or even the raw data added to other studies. I don't know what the case might be. But still, that possibility does not change the limits of an individual study. Let's say, for example, in a study that has 100 people in it, those 2 people, an N of 2, right? That's what we would expect. 1.6 are not man or not woman, the binary or something else. Those 2 people in a category still remains way too small for the independent quantitative inference. The third thing that they put in their article is that if gender is used in analysis, then we should explain what gender means and how it was measured. So this third recommendation applies only when gender is not merely a demographic descriptor of sorts, but also is actually used in the analysis. They say that researchers who use gender as a factor should explain their theoretical understanding of what gender represents. So now you're asking us to interpret gender according to whatever agenda you interpret gender according to whatever gender alternatives or theories, whatever you have. Now I have to do that. I have to explain what gender means in my research. They also say that researchers who include gender in their research should mention the exact question that people were asked to designate or indicate their gender. They should indicate what response options participants had available to them and how they turned those responses into analytical categories. And for this, their point is that if a study says women scored higher than men, for example, then readers need to know whether participants were asked about gender identity, sex assigned at birth, I'm not making this up, legal sex, self-description, or something else. Yeah, we're supposed to find all of that information out because we have a study of 100 people, and on average, we would expect 1.6 of them to be neither man nor woman. Now, that disclosure alone is fine in practice, I guess, but it doesn't solve this statistical issue. And this is where things get really, I'm not even going to say complicated, I'm going to say almost ridiculous. Now, those first 2 groups might support a cautious man versus woman comparison, right? Men and women. But the third category, those that are not men, not women, and maybe even 50 categories if they're able to just type in whatever they want for their gender, that category, or those extra 50 categories, whatever it is, those will not support a credible 3 or 50 different group comparison. And this is where their ethical and measurement logic runs into the basic mathematics of simple sample sizes. No amount of transparency can turn 2 respondents into a statistically meaningful comparison group. It's just not possible. And the fourth thing that they cover is explaining how other participants were treated in the analysis. By other, I mean not men, not women. And this is probably one of the most critical parts for us to critique here. These authors say that when gender is used as a variable in analysis, researchers should disclose whether transgender or non-binary participants were retained, excluded, or grouped into a category. I think they give a couple of other options as well. So they acknowledge that psychology has not settled on universal best practices. And so they list several possible approaches, such as excluding categories that are below a threshold, right? Very low sample sizes in a subgroup, or to perhaps even include 3 or more gender categories. Again, this is going to be a huge statistical and analytical nightmare. That's the authors actually admitting the problem that I mentioned. Here, the researchers must decide what to do with the small number of transgender and binary participants if gender is being analyzed, which leaves us with just a few options. For example, we could run a 3-group comparison anyway, but this would be absolutely statistically weak. A group that has an N of 2 cannot produce any stable averages, reliable standard deviations, or meaningful confidence interval. It's a horrible nightmare. Another option we would have is to combine those 2 people And by two, I mean those ones I was using in an example a moment ago. I'm just kind of continuing along with that same example. We could put those two participants in a group with men or women, but the authors would object to that because it treats that as potentially inaccurate coding or misclassification. And statistically, it's also very, very bad practice. So our third option, C here, is excluding the few people from any gender comparison analyses. And this is statistically defensible if it's disclosed clearly and you explain what you're doing and why. Many times it's not difficult to justify or for that to be acceptable. Those people can be included in any analysis where gender is not the variable or a variable that's being tested. But if it's between groups and ANOVA, ANCOVA, MANOVA, anything like that, would not be appropriate to be putting them in there. Another option that we have is to keep them in the overall sample, but report them only with descriptive statistics. So that treatment respects all of the relevant principles that these authors put forth. Those participants are kept in the sample as in the description. They're not used to manufacture a fake third comparison group or 48th, and they're not used for statistical inferential stats. So we tell people that they're in there, use them for descriptive stats, but don't include them with our inferential stats. One more thing that they also cover is using gender-inclusive language in materials and reporting. This is what you would expect it to be. So their final recommendation is about wording rather than data structure like we've been covering for just these last few minutes. So they encourage researchers to avoid language that assumes anyone is either male or female, such as using he and she as a universal reference or response options. They recommend gender-inclusive wording such as, oh, you guessed it, they. But again, that doesn't solve the sample size population, solves nothing for the analyses. I am not a statistician, by the way. I am not a data scientist. I've probably forgotten half of what I learned in grad school. If anybody is out there and they want to give us a more thorough explanation of why we can't do this, I'm keeping it as basic as I can while still trying to remember from my graduate courses. Somebody please let us know why this is an issue and if I'm not doing a good enough job of explaining why we can't do those things. So overall, there's really three distinct claims that they're making. People should be able to report their gender accurately. Researchers should transparently report who is in their sample. No problem with that, no problem with that. And that researchers should disclose exactly how they handle small gender categories when gender is used as a variable. Now, I don't necessarily have a big problem with that other than saying, as a researcher and understanding what happens when you have a very, very small number of people to include in an analysis, the most efficient and probably most stable way to approach it is to just not include them in your statistical analyses. All right, so that's more junk research for you today. I hope the context is helpful when you hear about studies or data that people are discussing. So cheers. Enjoy your day, everybody. I'll be back soon.